Luminar envoy Kael'thas, a shimmering confluence of sentient light patterns, regarded the human female, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, with a gentle, pitying curiosity. She sat in the designated interface chamber aboard the Luminar vessel, a small, fragile biped composed of dense matter, her sensory inputs, two optical organs, two auditory receptors, laughably primitive compared to Kael'thas's ability to perceive the universe across 1,000 spectra. The Luminar, ancient beings of pure energy, had observed humanity for millennia from their ethereal realm, a dimension interwoven with, yet distinct from, the physical universe. They saw humans as tragically constrained by their flesh, their emotions raw and unfiltered, their understanding of reality a mere shadow play on the wall of their biological cave. Human art, music, stories. These were, in the Luminar consensus, crude, if occasionally poignant, attempts to grasp the ineffable, like children daubing paint to represent a supernova. Your species, Dr. Hayes, Kael'thas's voice manifested as perfectly modulated tones, synthesized directly into Evelyn's auditory processing centers, experiences existence with such particularity, such attachment to the physical. We wish to offer a wider perspective. Evelyn Hayes, a historian specializing in humanity's darkest periods of collapse and subsequent rebirth, nodded politely. She'd been selected for this cultural exchange due to her extensive knowledge of what the Luminar termed societal trauma nodes. She understood their intent was benign, a form of gentle uplifting to show her a truer, unbound reality. She also suspected they had no real idea what they were about to encounter. "I am honored by the opportunity, Envoy," she replied, her voice calm. "We propose to explore a significant event from your past," Kael'thas continued. "A period you designate, the long silence, following the solar flare cataclysm. Our analysis indicates this was a time of profound species-level distress. By examining your understanding, your species' residual trauma, we hope to gently guide you towards a more expansive comprehension of cosmic impermanence." Evelyn's mind went to the archives, the fragmented records, the oral histories passed down through generations. The long silence. 2 centuries when Earth was plunged into a post-apocalyptic nightmare after a series of unprecedented solar flares collapsed global technology, decimated populations, and sundered nations. A time of brutal survival, of lost knowledge, of despair, but also of something else. "I understand," she said. "I am prepared to share what records and interpretations we have." The interface began. Kael'thas, with its vast, multi-dimensional consciousness, gently delved into Evelyn's mind, accessing not just her memories, but the gestalt of human historical understanding she represented. The Luminar expected to find raw data streams of suffering, statistics of death, images of ruined cities, echoes of fear and pain. They intended to overlay these with their own cosmic perspective, to show how such events were mere flickers in the grand, indifferent dance of galaxies, thereby soothing the perceived human fixation on their own brief, painful histories. Kael'thas first encountered the data, the sheer, brutal facts of the cataclysm, the breakdown of societies, the desperate struggle for resources. The Luminar catalogued this with dispassionate precision, predictable, the response of a biologically limited species to existential threat. But then, intertwined with the data, Kael'thas began to encounter something else, something unexpected. It wasn't just lists of the dead. It was names, stories attached to those names. A father who walked 1,000 kilometers through a poisoned wasteland to find medicine for his child, only to fail, yet whose story of unwavering paternal love was whispered around campfires for generations. A community that, facing starvation, chose to share its last scraps of food, ensuring that at least some would see the next sunrise, even if it meant others would not. Tales of scavengers who risked their lives not just for supplies, but to rescue ancient books, scraps of art, musical instruments from crumbling ruins, hoarding them not for material value, but for something Kael'thas couldn't immediately quantify. The Luminar, existing in a timeless, near-omniscient state, had little concept of linear narrative as humans experienced it. or the emotional weight humans attached to such narratives. Their own history was a static, interconnected web of all events, perceived simultaneously. As Caelthas delved deeper into the long silence through Evelyn's consciousness, it encountered not just the horror, but the human response to horror. It found records of defiance. In one ruined city, survivors had painstakingly cleared rubble to create a small garden, planting seeds saved from before the fall. A futile gesture against overwhelming desolation by Luminar logic. Yet the record conveyed a profound sense of triumph. It witnessed, through Evelyn's meticulously curated understanding, the birth of new legends. Heroes who were not mighty warriors, but healers, librarians, seed savers. Villains who were not just brutal tyrants, but those who hoarded hope, who tried to extinguish the flickering embers of community. Caelthas, the envoy, a being of pure light, felt something akin to confusion. This wasn't the simple, reactive trauma it had anticipated. This was layered, complex. It was grief, yes, but it was also anger, determination, and a strange, persistent, illogical drive that humans called hope. Hope, Caelthas accessed its vast databanks. The concept was filed under human emotional aberrations, illogical belief in positive outcomes despite contradictory evidence. It was considered a coping mechanism of a species unable to accept the harsh probabilities of existence. But what Caelthas was experiencing through Evelyn was not a passive coping mechanism. It was an active force. It was the stubborn refusal to succumb. It was the musician, his fingers raw from cold and hunger, coaxing a fragile melody from a battered violin in a refugee camp, and the way that melody made weary faces lift, just for a moment. It was the storyteller weaving tales of a brighter future around a dwindling fire, planting seeds of possibility in minds shadowed by despair. Your species, they did not simply endure, Caelthas transmitted to Evelyn, a new note of something unreadable in its synthesized voice. They created, even amidst utter collapse. They created meaning where, by our understanding, none should logically exist. Evelyn smiled faintly. We are a storytelling species, envoy. When the lights went out, we told stories in the dark. Stories of who we were, who we wanted to be again. Stories of rebuilding. Stories of hope. Caelthas focused on a specific set of records, the memory keepers, individuals and small groups during the long silence who dedicated their lives to preserving fragments of pre-cataclysm knowledge, art, and history, often at great personal risk. They memorized epic poems, scientific formulas, entire plays. They copied texts by hand onto salvaged scraps of material. Why? Most of this knowledge was useless for immediate survival. It wouldn't fill a hungry belly or mend a broken bone. Yet, as Caelthas sifted through the echoes of these memory keepers, accessed through Evelyn's academic immersion, it felt the sheer power of their conviction. They weren't just preserving data. They were preserving identity. They were preserving the idea of civilization, the dream of a future where such things would matter again. They were acting on a deeply ingrained faith that humanity, despite its current devastation, was worth preserving, that it would rise again. This, Caelthas realized with a jolt that resonated through its light form, was utterly alien to the Luminar experience. The Luminar were. They had always been. They would always be. They did not strive. They did not rebuild because they had never fallen. They did not hope for a better future because their present was a timeless, unchanging expanse of knowing. The Luminar envoy was then shown, through Evelyn's historical lens, the slow, painful emergence from the long silence, the first flickering lights of rediscovered science, the re-establishment of small, stable communities, the way the stories and saved knowledge of the memory keepers became the seeds of a new renaissance, how the shared trauma, instead of just breaking them, became a foundational narrative, a shared epic of survival and resilience that bound disparate groups together. The oh shit moment for Caelthas wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, dawning, and profoundly unsettling realization. The Luminar had come to dissect human trauma, expecting to find only weakness and confusion. Instead, they had found a terrifying, awe-inspiring strength. Not physical strength, not technological might, but a resilience of spirit, a stubborn, illogical insistence on finding light in absolute darkness, on rebuilding from ashes, driven by an abstract concept called hope and fueled by the power of shared stories. This primitive species, trapped in flesh, possessed an inner fortitude that the ethereal, timeless Luminar could barely comprehend, let alone replicate. Your capacity to carry such weight of sorrow and yet to not be extinguished by it, Caelthas struggled to articulate, to forge it into a foundation for renewal. This is not a limitation of your physical forms. This is a power born from it, from your finitude, from your capacity to lose and thus to value. Evelyn Hayes listened, a quiet sorrow and pride in her eyes. We fall, Envoy, we break, we suffer, but we also remember, we tell the stories, and we get up again, it's what we do. The interface ended. Caelthas withdrew, its usual serene patterns of light now flickering with a complex, agitated energy. It had come to offer humanity a wider perspective. It was leaving with one of its own. The report Caelthas delivered to the Luminar confluence was, by their standards, revolutionary. It did not speak of a primitive species in need of gentle uplifting. It spoke of a species whose perceived limitations, their physicality, their emotionality, their mortality, were the very crucible of an astonishing spiritual power. They are not trapped by their senses, Caelthas declared to the assembled Luminar. Their senses, their experiences of joy and pain, loss and love, are the raw material from which they forge an unbreakable will to persist, to create meaning. Their histories are not mere records of suffering, but epic poems of resilience. Their art is not a crude imitation of reality, but a defiant shout of hope into the void. We sought to show them the universe. They have shown us the strength of a single, determined heart. The Luminar confluence, a vast collective of ancient minds, was thrown into a state of profound re-evaluation. For eons, their existence had been one of detached observation, of static, timeless understanding. The concept of hope, as an active, world-shaping force, was utterly new. The idea that meaning could be created rather than simply perceived was paradigm-shattering. They began to study human art, music, and literature, not as curiosities, but as profound documents of the human spirit. Luminar linguists attempted the impossible, to translate the human concept of hope, of resilience in the face of despair, into their own language of light and energy. Early attempts were clumsy, producing discordant flickers. But some, after prolonged immersion in human narratives, began to create new patterns, new resonances within the Luminar gestalt, patterns that spoke not of timeless knowing, but of striving, of becoming, of light emerging from darkness. Humanity's place in the Luminar's cosmic understanding shifted forever. They were no longer the contained beings. They were the living embodiment of a force the Luminar had never known they lacked. A warning and an inspiration now flowed from the Luminar. Their physical shells may be fragile, their lifespans brief, but do not underestimate the universes of strength they carry within their stories, or the worlds they can rebuild with the sheer, irrational power of their hope. Their ancient, static society began to stir, touched by the distant, flickering candle of human resilience.